Welcome to this webinar on how to avoid fiscal action during the administrative review. During this webinar, we'll discuss what is fiscal action, what mistakes lead to fiscal action, and what are the most common mistakes that lead to fiscal action. First off, what is fiscal action? Fiscal action means the recovery of overpayment through direct assessment or offset of future claims by the state agency when any LEA claims or receives more federal funds than they have earned. So you receive money for serving reimbursable meals, and your claims must accurately reflect the number of reimbursable meals served by each eligibility type. When we are doing our administrative reviews, if we find that you have claimed payment for something that is not reimbursable or more payment than you have earned, then the state agency, or DESE, will recover the funds. Recovering that overpayment is what we call fiscal action. So what do you receive federal reimbursement for, and what determines how much federal funds you will get? First of all, you receive reimbursement for serving a reimbursable meal, so it needs to contain all the correct components in the correct quantities. Also, you receive reimbursement for each eligibility type, so how you determine those eligibilities determines how much reimbursement you receive. Since these are things that money is tied to, errors with these could result in fiscal action. These are all the areas that we look at during the administrative review. So which of these do you think could result in fiscal action? First is meal counting and claiming. Since you're counting the students and claiming the students by eligibility, this is tied to money, so any errors with that could result in fiscal action. Next is certification and benefit issuance. If you determine someone free or reduced when they weren't supposed to be, that's also tied to money and could result in fiscal action. Next is the after-school snack program. You're receiving reimbursement for counting snacks and serving the right components. So errors with after-school snack could result in fiscal action. Next is meal components and quantities. You're receiving reimbursement for a reimbursable meal, so it needs to have all the correct components and in the correct quantities. For the special milk program, you're receiving money for milks, and if you have errors in how you're counting those milks, you could receive fiscal action. For special provisions, you are receiving reimbursement based on documentation establishing claiming percentages, so any errors with those claiming percentages could result in fiscal action. And last is the fresh fruit and vegetable program. You're receiving money for serving fresh fruit and vegetables, so errors in that program could result in fiscal action. Errors in the rest of these areas that we look at during the administrative review would not result in fiscal action. Errors in some areas may result in the district being required to reimburse the food service account with general funds, but because the money is moving accounts within the LEA and not being returned to the state agency, this is not considered fiscal. With fiscal action, there is a $600 disregard, so we will only collect fiscal action if the amount goes over $600 per program. So if it goes over $600 for the school breakfast program, or for the special milk program, or for the national school lunch program, but included with the national school lunch program are seamless similar option, fresh fruit and vegetable program, and the after-school snack program. If there are errors in claiming percentages, then the $600 disregard does not apply. It is also state discretion to not apply the $600 disregard to correct systemic meal counting errors. So if we know those counts are not reliable and haven't been reliable, then we will not apply the $600 disregard. An underclaim means that the LEA claims less than the amount deemed properly reimbursable. If there is an underclaim, then the state agency does not pay the district back. So now I'm going to start discussing the different areas that result in fiscal action. And the first is certification and benefit issuance errors. These are some types of certification and benefit issuance errors that have resulted in fiscal action. So application approval errors, so using the incorrect household size or calculating income correctly. The incorrect status is transferred to the benefit issuance document. Missing documentation, so no supporting documentation showing how the student was certified as free or reduced. Backdating the eligibility status to the beginning of the year, and extending the 30-day carryover longer than 30 days. For certification and benefit issuance errors, we'll take fiscal action from the time of the month of review through the month of onsite. So usually we choose the month of review as the month immediately prior to the month of onsite, but sometimes we might have some months in between the month of review and the month of onsite. In that case, we would take fiscal action for all those months. So all the months between the month of review through the month of onsite. When we review benefit issuance and applications, we look at just a sample of the names, and if you have less than a 3% error rate, then we only take fiscal action for the building that we're reviewing. If the error rate is greater than 3%, then we take fiscal action for all buildings in the LEA. And once we start taking fiscal action for multiple buildings, then that's when the amount of money can really start adding up to larger amounts. So now I have a game of Fiscal Action Feud, and I'm looking for the top 3 answers for this question. I looked at data for the last 3 years for this question. So in the last 3 years, what were the most costly certification and benefit issuance errors? So not the most common, but what were the most costly errors? So answer number 3 is incorrect backdating, so backdating the eligibility to the beginning of the year. Answer 2 is carrying over their status for more than 30 days. And the number 1 answer is missing documentation. So I put together some best practices to avoid fiscal action due to certification and benefit issuance errors. First, when we contact you about your review, your reviewer will request the number of free and reduced students in your LEA. Please respond to this quickly. This will give you more time to pull that documentation and make sure nothing's missing. Next, make sure you have documentation on file for every student and have it ready for the review. Next, print out documentation for students with extended eligibility. Oftentimes when we're on review, this is what takes us a long time to try and find is those extended eligible students. So please have that documentation ready for us. And then if you find errors while you're preparing for your review, then go ahead and correct them. The next area of fiscal action I wanted to talk about is meal counting and claiming. So I wanted to discuss point of service meal counts. Acceptable point of service meal counts include coded roster checklist or just a regular roster or checklist, coded tickets or tokens, not that show the eligibility type, but coded in another way, and electronic systems that would use a student ID card, a PIN number, or a biometric finger ID, or looking up the students by names and entering them into the electronic system. Unacceptable meal counts are anything that don't provide counts at the point of service. So attendance counts are not acceptable, tray and entree counts are not acceptable, head counts, classroom counts, or counts taken anywhere other than that point of service. Also, any acceptable system that isn't implemented properly is not acceptable. So if you're not checking if the meals are reimbursable at the point of service, then that's no longer an acceptable system. So these are some examples of meal counting and claiming errors that have resulted in fiscal action. Meals not counted at the point of service, Meals not counted by eligibility type at the point of service. Point of service meal counts not used for the claim. Meals not monitored for meal pattern compliance at the point of service. And incorrect numbers entered into the claim. And then second or other ineligible meals claimed. For meal counting and claiming errors, we will take fiscal action back to the beginning of the error, since none of the claims can be assured that they are accurate. So often cases, this will go back to the beginning of the year. I just wanted to reiterate that attendance counts are not acceptable meal counts. If you take attendance counts, then you'll have corrective action and you'll be required to do a 30-day recalculation, and that will likely result in fiscal action. So a 30-day recalculation is when you have unreliable meal counts and we require you to correct your system, so have an acceptable meal count system in place. Once that is accepted and approved, then we will collect 30 days of meal counts from you. Those meal counts will be normalized to adjust for seasonal and monthly trends in participation, and then those 30-day counts will be applied to the time period that you had the unreliable meal counts. So that will result in fiscal action. So, are attendance counts acceptable meal counts? No, they are not. How about in these situations? Are attendance counts acceptable meal counts for these situations? How about for pre-K? How about for alternative schools or classrooms? Or how about for field trips? No, attendance counts are not acceptable in these circumstances. So oftentimes we'll see that the regular meal service has an acceptable meal count, but then there'll be additional meal counts like pre-K or alternative schools that they're using attendance counts. So make sure you're using point of service meal counts wherever you're counting those meals. This is an example of a standard setup for the point of service. The point of service is at the end of the line, and that's the best place to accurately determine that a complete reimbursable meal is served. By that time, the student reaches the point of service, they have had the opportunity to select all the food components for a complete meal, and the person at the point of service is able to accurately count complete reimbursable meals. These are setups that result in problems with the point of service. If your point of service is located at the beginning or in the middle of the line, then it creates problems. In these examples, there would be no way of knowing if the student selected a reimbursable meal, so these are not acceptable setups for counting meals. To fix this problem, you could have a second person stationed at the end of the line to make sure the student's meal is reimbursable. The person stationed at the end must have a way of communicating with the person at the point of service in case the student does not select a reimbursable meal. If you choose to operate this two-person point of service, you must first receive approval from DESE, and you can do that by completing and submitting an updated methods of collection and meal counting form. So now we have another game of fiscal action feud. And in this question, in the last 3 years, what was the most costly meal counting and claiming error? And the number one answer is no point of service. The next area we could take fiscal action is for meal component and quantity errors. These are examples of errors that could result in fiscal action. Meals missing components, repeat findings for missing vegetable subgroups, and repeat findings for missing milk variety or unallowable milk type, and then also missing production records. For a meal to be reimbursable, all components must be offered. So at lunch, the components are fruit, vegetables, grains, meat and meat alternates, and fluid milk. And at breakfast, the components are fruit, grains, and fluid milk. So now we have another game of Fiscal Action Feud. This one's a little different, but in the last 3 years, what were the most common missing components that resulted in fiscal action over $600? So what are the most common missing components? The number 3 answer is fruit. Number 2 is a repeat vegetable subgroup. And answer number 1 is grains. So when I was looking at the data that resulted in fiscal action over $600, I was looking at the missing grains at lunch and what LEAs were serving that they were missing a grain. So what do you think they might have been serving that resulted in them missing a grain? Here's a hint. These are the meals that were missing grains. So chicken and mashed potatoes, barbecue riblets and potato salad, meatloaf and baked potato, and Salisbury steak and mashed potato. That meal was actually served at multiple LEAs that resulted in fiscal action over $600. So you can see a trend there. When they're serving potatoes, they're forgetting to serve a grain because the potato counts as a starchy vegetable, not a grain. So make sure on your menus when you're serving potatoes that you also have a grain available for those students. When I was looking at why there was a missing grain at breakfast, I also saw some trends. LEAs were serving meat alternates without grain, so yogurt, scrambled eggs, and omelets. Remember that meat alternates can only be counted toward the grain component after you serve the daily grain requirement. So you need to serve at least 1 ounce of grain each day, and then you can add additional meat alternates, but you have to serve a grain each day. When I was looking at what happened when schools were missing fruit, this is what I found. They were serving fruit-flavored ice cream, fruit-flavored yogurt, pudding, and Jell-O. So remember, just because it's fruit-flavored doesn't mean it has fruit in it, and it certainly doesn't mean that it is fruit. So make sure you're not just serving something that's fruit flavored, make sure you're serving actual fruit. And then when I was looking at what resulted in missing vegetables, I didn't see any trends. It was just getting left off the menu. So make sure you're serving vegetables for all your lunches. If we find a missing component during the review period, we'll look at what was served for the month of review and the month of on-site and take back funds for all meals missing the component. If you're serving the same menu at multiple schools, we will also take fiscal action for those other schools. And if it is severe, we could possibly take fiscal action for previous months also. We are also required to take fiscal action for a repeat missing vegetable subgroup finding. If you had a missing vegetable subgroup during your previous review and you have another missing subgroup during your review, then we will take fiscal action. And it doesn't have to be from the same subgroup, so you could have been missing red-orange last review and missing dark green this review, and it would still be fiscal action. So what do you think are the most common missing subgroups? The most common missing subgroups were beans, peas, legumes, and dark green vegetables. So I want to go through a quiz to see if you know which subgroups these vegetables fall under. So the first is green beans. Green beans are an other subgroup. So they are not in the beans, peas, and legumes category. They are an other. How about green peas? Those are actually in the starchy subgroup, not in beans, peas, and legumes. And lima beans, those are also a starchy vegetable. Black beans are actually beans, peas, and legumes. And split peas are beans, peas, and legumes. So the beans, peas, and legumes group is the mature, dried beans, so things like black beans and split peas. So what about Brussels sprouts? Brussels sprouts are actually part of the other subgroup. They're not dark green. Pinto beans are beans, peas, legumes. Zucchini are other, and romaine lettuce is dark green. The way we assess fiscal action for a repeat missing vegetable subgroup finding is we average out 1 week and take 1 day's average counts as non-reimbursable. Another repeat finding that we have to take fiscal action for is a repeat milk finding. It could be that you weren't serving a variety, so you only had one option, or it could be that you were serving an unacceptable milk type, such as 2%. So remember, it's required to offer at least 2 types of milk for each meal, and the acceptable milk types are flavored low-fat 1%, unflavored low-fat 1%, flavored fat-free, and unflavored fat-free. Here. So depending on when the review is during this review, this could potentially be a very large amount of money. So it could be all the meals in the entire year. So make sure if you had a milk finding your previous review that you get it corrected for your next review. We don't take fiscal action for pre-K meal patterns since it is new, but just remember that if pre-K is not commingled with other grades, then they must be served the CACFP meal pattern, which means they cannot have flavored milk. If production records are missing, then we don't know if you were serving reimbursable meals or not, so we would depend on other documentation such as invoices and inventory tracking records to see if you are serving reimbursable meals. If you did not have any documentation to show that you were serving reimbursable meals, then we would take fiscal action for all those meals. All right, we have another game of Fiscal Action Feud. We're looking for the top 2 answers in this question. So in the last 3 years, what were the most costly meal component errors? So again, not the most common, but what were the most costly meal component errors? Answer number 2 is the missing grain, and answer number 1 is the repeat milk variety or type finding. And you can see that the missing milk finding adds up to a large amount of money because it goes back to the beginning of the year. The next area of fiscal action are the special provisions. The special provisions we have our community eligibility provision. This is where all students eat free and the meal claiming is based on identified student percentage or the percentage of directly certified students. The next is Provision 2, where all students eat free and the meal claiming percentages for subsequent years are determined during the base year with standing counting procedures. And Provision 3 is claiming based on prior funding levels. These are some errors that result in fiscal action for special provisions. First is missing eligibility documentation. Next is including students in the identified student percentage for CEP that aren't allowed, such as foster based on an application or SNAP from a case number application. Next is the number of identified students or number of total enrollment does not match the documentation. There's no supporting documentation to show what you're claiming is correct. And then last, not counting the students by their eligibility during the base year for Provision 2. For special provisions, we correct the claims back to the beginning of the year, so fiscal action goes back to the beginning of the year. Another game of Fiscal Action Feud, we just have the top answer in this, and the question is, in the last 3 years, what was the most costly special provision error? And the answer is, documentation did not support the claiming percentages. For other programs, the fiscal action is for reasons similar to what we take fiscal action for at breakfast and lunch. For snacks, if they were missing a component or ineligible snacks were claimed. For fresh fruit and vegetable, if you had unallowable costs or unsupported costs that you were claiming. For example, if you didn't have an invoice showing that what you were claiming was actually purchased, or if you were claiming fruits and vegetables that you served for lunch, or serving unallowable costs such as frozen or canned fruit. For seamless summer, fiscal action could result from meal counting and claiming errors and missing meal components, just like during the regular school year. And for special milk, it could be because of certification and benefit issuance errors, counting and claiming errors such as no point of service or claiming all milks in the free category. Also remember when we consider the $600 disregard, the after-school snack, fresh fruit and vegetable, and seamless summer option are included with National School Lunch Program. The USDA has given the state agency some flexibility in taking fiscal action. We can extend fiscal action back to the beginning of the year or back to previous years. We could take fiscal action for repeat violations for component quantities and whole grain rich errors, and we could take fiscal action for repeat findings for not meeting calorie limits, saturated fat, sodium, and trans fat. So our last section is a summary of the fiscal action that we've talked about. On this slide on the left, we have the percentage of errors by category. So these are the most common errors that resulted in fiscal action over $600 in the last 3 years. So you can see the main reason was for meal counting and claiming errors, followed by certification and benefit issuance errors, then missing meal components, CEP, and after-school snack. If we do the same graph but breaking it down by dollar amount, we can see the most expensive errors were the missing meal components. This is largely due to repeat findings with milk, since those go back to the beginning of the year. If we didn't include those repeat milk findings, this would be a lot lower. Then you can see that's followed by CEP errors, then certification and benefit issuance errors, then meal counting and claiming errors, and last, after-school snack program errors. This chart shows the average dollar amount of fiscal action by category for LEAs with fiscal action over $600 in the last 3 years. So the average amount of fiscal action for CEP errors was over $16,000, followed by missing meal components, then certification and benefit issuance, meal counting and claiming, and after-school snack. So to end, I put together a checklist to avoid fiscal action. This isn't comprehensive, but if you're following this, you should be in good shape. First, ask yourself, do I have eligibility documentation for every free and reduced student? Was the eligibility determined correctly? Do I take meal counts at the point of service? And do my claims represent the point of service meal count? Do I count students by eligibility and monitor meals for compliance at the point of service? Do all meals contain all the required meal components? Am I serving all the vegetable subgroups during each week? Do I offer at least 2 types of milk at each meal service? Are the milk types I offer allowable? Do I complete and retain production records? Do I have base year documentation if I'm operating CEP or other provisions? And does the base year documentation match my identified student percentage or claiming percentages? So that ends the webinar on how to avoid fiscal action. If you have any questions, feel free to contact your nutrition program specialist or please contact me.